All right, everybody, hello and welcome. You are here for the monthly jobs report, focusing on January uh, and really the last couple of months in regards to our entire job hunt situation and how the economy is functioning and working. And I'm glad to have all of you here today to really listen in and also offer your questions, your thoughts, your insights, and your worries as we go through this job market. My name, as usual, is Albert. I'm the founder of Albert's List, which is hosting this webinar, and we are here to help you gain career, job search, and AI skills that will help you become the most resilient professional possible. And we offer this programming as an addition so that you can be informed in your job search as you go through this economy and all of its topsy-turvy turns so that you can know what to do and what to expect or justify why your job search could be a struggle. With me, as always, is also Dr. White, who is Dr. Reilly White, who is Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning and tenured full professor of finance at the University of New Mexico's Anderson School of Management. He's also director for the $6 million student run.
$6. That's right.
$6 million student run University of New Mexico Regents portfolio and leads a series of financial literacy projects in the community. If you are looking for his full biography, I'm going to go ahead and drop and paste that link here into the webinar chat. He has many credentials that make him very qualified to lead this webinar today. If you're also wondering, we are recording this webinar, so I will send something around probably within the day. And if you have any questions and you have anything that you'd like to offer, feel free to throw it in the webinar chat, use the Q&A, and just overall be merry. We are a very friendly crowd here. We are a very curious and insightful crowd too. So use that to your full advantage as you figure out where things are headed. Okay, Dr. White, welcome back. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hey, thank you so much, Albert, for the introduction, and thank you guys for being back here. I appreciate seeing some familiar names here. As always, I cannot thank you enough for spending the random day of a week each month that we meet to discuss these topics. And I know it's 5 p.m. and you're looking at things and you want to go home, or maybe you're at home, or maybe you work from home, or maybe you're coming from a shared apartment of 85 people, and the sound of my nasally voice drowns out all your other roommates. But it's grateful that you made it here tonight. We're going to talk a lot about the jobs report. No such thing as a dumb question, so please enter it. I know, raining in California. When it rains in California, it's cloudy in New Mexico, as they say. And so here we are. Hey, Aaron, am I going to see you in March in LA? I'm looking forward to it. So yeah, now we're cooking with Crisco. So I booked my frequent flyer mile tickets. So let's talk a little bit about some of the data that we've got. And I got some cool papers also that Aaron very courteously sent me and brought my attention to that we can discuss. So we've talked a lot about the job market, and there's a few things going on that you should know. So the jobs numbers have not been pleasant. We added 130,000 jobs in January. That's not bad. And you might even say in an economy where we're draining our country of a immigrant workforce that that's not a bad number, but it is actually coming on the heels of our annual revision. And our annual revision this year dropped the number of jobs in 2025 by slightly over a million. 1,029,000 fewer jobs than we previously estimated in 2025. So let's talk about that. Annual revisions are par for the course when it comes to Bureau of Labor statistics. We were here last year talking about them, and they were also a big deal. And what they mean is that we're going to go into detail about them in a little bit. There's a whole bunch of new information that comes in, everything from population growth to a bunch of other series of economic data. And so while individual monthly jobs reports are often revised for the 1, 2, and 3 months following their release, the big annual revision is often a very much needed correction that adjusts the size of the labor force. And because, of course, we have fewer people in this economy than we thought we did, and we have fewer jobs, we significantly across most sectors, in fact, we were downward revised about up to the tune of a million jobs. So where did those million jobs go? A million people signing up for Albert's List. So where are the good signs so far? So we'll start a little positive about this. Healthcare and social assistance were both up. Healthcare and social assistance are interesting topics. Healthcare was up about 82,000. But we did see losses in the federal government, 34,000. We're now down more than a third of a million people in the Fed in the last year. Financial activities surprisingly down 22,000, as well as transportation down 12. Labor force participation is been relatively steady, and employment population ratio is still holding around 59.8. But unemployment is still around 4.3%. So, what are the good and bad news about this? Not catastrophic by any means, but let's talk about what some of this data looks like and what it and where we're going with this, and actually fundamentally, what does it mean? And so jobs data like this, if we're a growing economy, a number of, like we were, when we have higher than normal immigration, we expect numbers around 200, 250,000, probably equilibrium for a growth economy. With population growth lower, 150 might be more appropriate. But we've seen the tendency has been significantly downward in the last year on a month-to-month basis. And across the board, when we adjust according to some of the seasonally adjusted numbers that we have, I love the Bureau of Labor Statistics for including their embedded tables. I love things that look like they're printed with a dot matrix printer, like I'm rocking and rolling, like I've just logged into Gopher and it's 1991 again, and I can print out and I can print out just this massive amount of information. I used to do that. I got stuck. I used to go to my local library and I'd use their printer back before they had rules on such things. And I'd print out weather data. And I was like, and they're like, what are you going to use that for? And I'm like, I'm a kid. I'm like, weather data. I need climatological data. And they didn't know how to respond to that. So they just let me keep it. Melanie says my typing class in high school made us do that. I was like, oh, this is good. What a skill. I'm sure it's one that you're grateful with every day. And Jochen says a gopher when the focus was still 100% on information and the ad was misspelled 8DT. That's true. Incidentally, that was true. You could get information that it was all about just the data. It was such a pure time. So take a look at this monthly data as we kind of go down in this. And so it goes through the entire year. December's preliminary. But you want to look at that left column is that's the revised and the previously published estimate and the difference. Now, the difference is collectively downward. When something like population itself is lower or there's other aspects, you're starting even in January from 785,000 below. But then look at the month-on-month change as revised versus as previously published. So the numbers we were hitting earlier in the year in 2025, 100,000 jobs, 102, 120, 158, were more like a 48,000 loss, a 42,000 jobs, 67,000, 108. The column over here, so the from the right, the second and third columns, that difference is just gigantic between those two values. And this is typical for the year, but it's in the downward angle. And just look at this, like this whole year, 2025, it has been astonishingly jobless when adjusted for this when adjusted for the most recent data. So even the numbers we were reporting as preliminary, when I was like, oh, 108,000, and we lost 173,000, 56,000. Most of these, the majority of them ended up being more optimistic than they ended up actually being. And some of these have been previously revised as well. And so we're looking at a situation where our GDP is growing, but it is a jobless growth in this market. It is something where there's not a lot of hiring, there is firing, but it's not overly significant, but there isn't a lot of hiring. And that is the biggest issue, which is absolutely fascinating to grapple with. Christine, surprised the current admin hasn't fired someone for making revisions again. I also had the same thing, Christine. I said, my goodness, this BLS data, somebody's getting sacked on this one. And I don't know who it's going to be, but this is not going to please various people. Siokin says, do you think that these numbers already reflect some polishing of the data, so things might be worse? This is a good question, Joachim, and I want to address this issue in particular. And one economist that I follow, who is outstanding in her field, is Claudia Sahm, and Claudia is the creator of the Sahm rule, which is a recession indicator that talks about, if your unemployment rate goes up about 0.5%, then you might be in a recession. But she actually weighed in on this fairly recently. And there's a lot of discrepancies. It is so crucial that economists report good data. It's used for policies across the country. It's valuable. And it's incredibly important to keep a lot of the functions of government going. And she weighed in on this. And I'm trying to find the exact post, but she noted that there's not evidence per se of manipulation right now, and it is damaging to the economic field to consider it, but it's always worth questioning. And so right now, if it is being, if somebody's lying about it, I suspect they would lie a little bit more positively than what we've been seeing. But I still have hope that BLS right now is fundamentally acting in its best interest, which is great. Um, and Melanie says nobody full time at the BLS. The temp staff mistakenly published these. Oh, that's so true. They're like, hey, whose intern did this? Is what this is. Who's gonna rock and roll with this? This is terrible. Anyway, so so where are these jobs happening? Because you're sitting around, if you're in the information sector, maybe you're an engineer, maybe you're a software engineer, maybe you're a hardware engineer, maybe you're even one of those detested electrical engineers. Maybe you're not an engineer at all, but you are in your mind. So if you exclude healthcare employment, the U.S. has actually lost jobs since 2024. This is using BLS data as presented by the Financial Times. And so if you look at where we really stand in the job market, breaking this out differently, healthcare and private education in general have seen, significant growth to the tune of about almost 2 million jobs since 2024. If you aren't in those two sectors, if you're not in ed, and by ed, it's not severely ed. It's not like I'm here at public universities. We're hiring thousands of people. It's not us. Healthcare industry in general has been, because of various things, demographics, finance ratio, all those things, has been rocking and rolling. Now, the other fields, even things that are quote unquote positive, like construction, leisure and hospitality, other services, we're talking to the tune of a couple 100,000 in job growth since 2024. Half the sectors, half the sectors are losing jobs and are smaller than where they were 2 years ago. One of which, of course, is the information sector, big in the Bay Area, really big in San Jose. And then you've got retail trade, wholesale trade, even mining and logging. For the Alberts List loggers here, I know it's been hard for you. You're right there. You're working in this. You're in Modesto trying to find a tree. But any of those things, just chopping down people's front yard things. But anyway, it's a tough environment for most sectors. And so that's what we're seeing. Scott says, to what extent may have the federal government workers who took other jobs during the fall season government shutdown create the as revised numbers when they left their shutdown jobs in order to take secondary jobs to make ends meet, and then again create the as revised numbers when the shutdown concluded? Oh, that's interesting. That's really good. So let's break that down, Scott. That's a good question. It's a good perspective. So what is the effect, if any? So shutdown workers would be interesting because, shutdown officially wouldn't be counted under our unemployment numbers because it would be considered a leave of absence this way. If you are looking at questions where, like, for instance, if you're looking at the actual federal layoffs, for instance, as a whole, where the government is attempting various levels of attempts at streamlining, quote unquote, the government in various capacities, that's included in the unemployment numbers. And some of that may be affecting some of that revision numbers, greater job losses in the Fed sector in particular, where there is a bit of a delay between when people might be laid off and when people are recognized or choose to take unemployment or they aren't able to find a job. So that's valid. But I think for this case, it won't be based on individual government shutdown situations that way, because you're talking about leave of workers not paying them, but they're still on the books and they can't, get another job in that intervening time period. So this is interesting. But then they take secondary jobs to make ends meet. Maybe they are to a certain extent, and those effects, because shutdowns as a whole, even the last one that we had that was over, 30 days long, aren't so huge in time that we see a huge number of workers surge into jobs where they're all at coffee shops and WeWork and just, doing stuff. So that's actually, I love the way you're thinking about this though, which is interesting. Now, Albert says, is healthcare the way it is because of Balmer's cost disease? Oh, what's really going on? Will things change if we get robots? Balmer's cost disease. In 2 seconds, for those who are interested, is an observation by the famous economist Balmer that said, hey, look, sometimes some industries get more productive. For instance, the information sector. You do a lot more things, you create more value. And some industries Despite all the technological growth that we've seen, such as education, I can only teach so many classes, such as, for instance, in orchestra, which requires people, of course, to play the instruments, or construction, actually, where you've got people who are actually less productive now than they were 50 years ago, which is another. I have that chart buried in here somewhere. Balmos disease points out that there are rising costs in these industries where productivity is often stagnated. And so in these things, is healthcare one of those industries? Partially it is, and so I think that that's some of the answer. And to your answer, Albert, I think we're pushing up healthcare expenses to such a level, and the research does show that the higher the expenses get, the greater likelihood of replacement through other forms of cost control. Unless we're issuing more doctors doing other things, I think the future is the AI or robo doctor at some level. And whether that gets introduced slowly or quickly is the question. But I think we're at a level right now where I think that's absolutely it has become it's getting so increasingly expensive that companies with greater efficiency ratios will be able to seek out benefits to productivity and cost management through an expansion of automated labor. But in that sense, so the hesitation on that, the barriers to that sort of adoption are us as people themselves, right? Because I can flip the switch and invent a new technology, and because it takes adaptation and systems have to adapt and all these other things, it won't be used by everybody tomorrow. We're actually going to talk a little bit about the cycles of innovation and how innovation cycles have been declining over the last 100 years or so. And so that's actually leads me to suggest that it will be sooner rather than later where we'll see some of this. So get a job in healthcare to perpetuate the bureaucracy. I think we all have to get a job, unfortunately, somewhere. I too, that's the hard part. And there is a lot in healthcare, in bureaucracy in these areas. Aaron says, quite correctly, we need 1 million more doctors to slam into the medical labor force that will collapse the cost of healthcare by 20%, get 100% access. Let's find a competent doctor and clone them 1 million times. It'll be like multiplicity, but each one gets slightly more incompetent. It's going to be one of those. Hospitals relying on telehealth instead of hiring. Also true, right? Telehealth. If you're a doctor, there's so many, doctors. You all might be a doctor. You have these things. I gave a financial literacy presentation. I developed a course for doctors here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We have such a God, I've never met a group of unfortunately so talented but so profoundly unhappy people. You go to these expensive universities, you do all these things, and then suddenly your incentives are to go from client to client to client, 15 minutes, no personalized relationship, and you're just working in like a health mine. Trying to get as many people, addressed as possible. It is just terrible. Rhoda says Medicare cuts reduce reimbursements to telehealth. Also true, and that also creates different incentives there. So this is the thing. I know it's crazy. And then you go to undergraduate students, it takes the years of education, the residencies, or multiple residencies in some cases for people doing different specialties is just outrageously long. And so there's a lot of things here. So if you're looking at the health market, to get to Aaron's point about adding more doctors, we have sort of this artificial scarcity. And we all know about this. The American Medical Association 40 years ago said, hey, look, we got to be careful about our supply of doctors, and they kind of overshot the pendulum, the swing too far one way, where it's too restrictive right now in different medical schools. And so there is, unfortunately, a vast shortage of physicians. We have healthcare deserts across the United States, where you're not able to find this. And so that begs the question is, what is the comparable solution? So if you're not willing to increase the supply of doctors, how do you increase the supply of healthcare? And you have to look to technology. I don't see another way out of this other than because they don't see, the medical associations as they are suddenly deciding to admit, or for instance, one question we worked on here in New Mexico, how do we transfer international licenses into the United States is daunting and extremely difficult. And so we could go on importing doctors from other places, but we have to be a little bit better about that about our license conversion. And so it's just extraordinary. And Michael says, a libertarian nurse I know says that the main reason that healthcare is so expensive is that they get the big dollars from insurance companies. Now, that's true. It's all interesting. It's all a cycle. We had a window of time in the 1970s, which I think was our last true window, and truly looking at sort of a nationalized healthcare system, and we didn't have it, and so that comes with benefits and drawbacks. The benefits are we have, of course, access to some very outstanding technologies sometimes in healthcare, but for a very small number of people. The downside, of course, is the prohibitive cost of healthcare. And so it is an extraordinary, extraordinary question for the next 25 years for us to address. And I worry that we will not address it. Melanie says concierge practice is a lot less headache for doctors. No Medicare, no insurance, but let's just do it. Let's rock and roll. What do you need? You need the meds? Yeah, give me a blood test. Let's rock and roll. Aaron says create 100 more medical schools in the US. I like that number. Aaron has always great like political platform statements. 100 more medical schools. Expand 200 medical schools student pool. Double it. Go back to the old model of dual enrollment and integrate into high school and community colleges. I agree. Oh, 100%. I just need so it's like everyone sees it. We're like, what is the problem in healthcare? It's like, and I understand this. I'm in education. We're the other problem. When people aren't talking about healthcare, they're talking about education. Here I am, I'm a bureaucrat. I'm a mid-level bureaucratic manager of a college. I totally understand this. And so we're the problem. Yes, and I'm the problem. It's me. It's the Taylor Swift issue. So we've got this interesting. Now I got people. Do I earn anything? I mean, I don't know. I'm amazed I'm alive, Albert, when I think about the shenanigans that I've lived through. And to Aaron's point, though, it is difficult for self-perpetuating systems to arrive at that level of drastic idea making. And I find that one of my issues with legislative advisory and other things that I do with my spare time to kind of get policy going or look at these things, people have every incentive to not make those policy choices or not take bold positions on policies like these. It is truly hard in our system because at the end of the day, we're looking at this and we're tired. We want to go home. We work all the time. And you're like, I could do this fight if I had these things. And you go, no, I'll just keep the system as it is. And so I really, really value it. There we go, Albert. Yeah, 10 million annual. Yeah, that's right. I'm worth 10 million. What is the least valuable currency right now in the world? I'm worth 10 million of that. Um, Circa 2008 Zimbabwe dollars. Jochen says Albert can't pay an educator that kind of money. It's reserved for pro athletes. What about pro mathletes? That's what I want to know. So let's talk about our prime age employment rates. And so one critique, and I'm gonna weave a couple of concurrent policy issues into this situation. One is that so we've got a lot of policies in the last year, and this is one of my Joe Politano chart, always famous for their classic black ensemble here. Did the last year of America First policies, did this result in greater employment rates for native-born American workers? And now the answer, as it turns out, is it has not. It has not done so. And in fact, if we look at our our native born workers, and the solid is the moving average, and the dashed is the actual monthly data. It's not been stellar since basically late 2024. Foreign-born workers actually have an employment rate that's also remained relatively steady, and so this is very interesting. Oh, look, urgent care service for free. Michael says until very recently, students get a medical degree in another country a lot cheaper than take the U.S. board exams and become U.S. doctors. There's always what is it, the Caribbean pathway, right, for getting into medical school, where you can go to one of the Caribbean colleges and present that too. And this has been, and it's not enough. And so, okay, a paper from Aaron. It's great read. It's only what 150 pages, but this is fun. So this is a paper that came out in 2024 or it's in SSRN, so you can find it. It's called New Frontiers: The Origins and Content of New Work, 1940 and 2018. And so of interest to, of course, the Alberts List market. And again, I thank Aaron for bringing this one to my attention, and I got some key things here. So one question is, you might looking at yourself and you might find yourself, why are there so many managers, but there's so few supervisors? And there's this question here, and this is some Washington Post charts that address this issue. And then I encourage you to read the origin and content of new work as well. And so you notice that basically since the year, since the last year 2000, we have become a management culture as opposed to a supervisor culture. And one of the reasons that the Washington Post and other research posits is because of this is because of the growth in educated jobs. And so what this article goes on to talk about is that the titles of the jobs have changed to accommodate the higher educational attainment of the workforce, but are essentially some type of window dressing. And so for us going out there and you say, I'm a manager, and you do these things, and I walk into my work, I've got, as I pointed out, we just went to a new time card software internally. And then it popped up on my screen and it says, you have 38 of these to approve. And I went, oh boy, I love management. But I never said I love supervising. But supervisors are on the wane. And so if you look at the question of supervisory attainment, managers with a bachelor's or higher dominating in the bottom central part there, supervisors often may have lower educational attainment. And so one way to increase your workforce is potentially happiness and joy is to give them a manager role instead of a supervisor one. Congratulations, we've become a culture of management. And this is just delightful. Aaron says if you have an econ degree and still like it and finish raising your kids, you have all the time to watch TV shows and read econ papers for fun. Thank you, Aaron. This one is good. It is some really awesome stuff. And I got another one for you too, for those of you in the cheap seats and those of you who are looking at this. So I'm going to quote a few academic papers in here. I have very little use in relative and practical human society. But one of them is I can read a bunch of economic papers and tell you which are interesting. So this is actually a good one by some credible researchers across the board, Curvino et al. What is the economic impact of mass deportations? And so this is interesting. Like any economic question, there are trade-offs, and we have to acknowledge them. And what I encourage people when they have an economic question, check it out on Google Scholar, take a look at this question, look at what's cited out there, and find a paper that works. And this one's very interesting. So this paper looks at large-scale deportations on things like wages, prices, and real incomes in the United States. And so they impute legal status. They talk about the data for each worker in the American Community Survey. And then in 2024, 3% or so of US workers were unauthorized, but some regions and sectors were heavily dependent on authorized immigrant labor. And so they do all this estimation work. And then I'm going to start over here at the bottom here, and I'll not all this stuff which says here's kind of the analytical techniques that we operated under. Following the removal of 50% of unauthorized immigrants, in the short run, average native real wages rise 0.15% nationally. You're like, wow, it raises wages in the short run. So keep reading. Driven by an increase in the capital labor ratio. In other words, you take workers from an area and move them out. That does increase the value of the labor that's performed. But what happens? In the long run, native real wages fall in every state and by 0.33% nationally. Like every economic idea, short-term benefit, yay, meets long-term severe economic cost as capital gets decumulated in response to a lower population. Consumer prices in the sectors intensive to unauthorized workers, such as farming, rise by about 1% relative to the price of the average consumption basket. So, what did we learn? Family, kids, enemies, and friends. We've got this situation where if you do deport a lot of workers, you might see short-term benefits to wages, but the lower population actually decreases competitiveness and wages in the market. Capital flies out of the system, people get poorer, and then just the icing on the cake, prices actually rise. And so, so if you've got a choice, whatever, regardless of your opinions on such matters, it is a trade-off and there are consequences to those things. Now, you might say, so somebody on the outside, you might say, oh, well, it does all these, it's not really about wages, it's about laws. And, yeah, there are things that you can do to improve these things and improve these outcomes. But do take a look at what some of the papers say. Now, another thing that we're cruising on Immigrant Mountain for, does spending on immigrant cause government deficits? As it turns out, it does not. So this is the most eloquent thing. It is from the Cato Institute, which does a bunch of friendlier stuff on this, but feel free to check the current Census Bureau's population data and the national income product accounts. It's not incredible amounts of data. So first of all, in a general year, spending is a higher bar than taxes. And the taxes that are paid by the immigrants as a whole is a larger chunk versus the spending that goes towards immigrants themselves. They are younger than the US population as a whole, more entrepreneurial, and pay more into the system than they actually take out. And so, one thing that is a worry, especially in the long term, as our perspective on immigration as a country currently changes, is we're kind of handicapping one of our one what is ultimately a already challenging fiscal situation for the government by moving away a population that creates more taxes than less spending. It is a fascinating discourse. Now, innovation. Back to what I was talking about before. So another cool paper. This one's hot off the presses. This is a great one by Asarvartham Moksky and the legendary Andrei Schleifer, who, of course, is third author, probably added to this. It is alphabetical, but Schleifer's stuff is the best there is. Now, two things to observe here. This paper that they write, GPT as a measurement tool, is a wandering journey through like 10 subjects. I don't know what they're getting this published in. I can't do it. If this came across my desk as a reviewer of journals, I'd be like, split this mofo into four different things. I don't know what to do with this. But the last part of this paper, at the very end of this, speaking of, having time to take a look at this, you've got this explanation about innovation, which is like the best takeaway from this and the most relevant for the Bay Area. And so it takes a long historical view of innovation in the economy, and that does a few interesting observations. So on the left, you've got the question of when stuff gets adopted versus when it actually gets invented. And so I like to toss about, oh, we solved the problem of telephone operators in the 1920s technologically, but we still had telephone operators hired in the 80s because of all the barriers in the system. And so this adoption lag has been decreasing pretty substantially in the last 2 centuries, which is this data set. And right now, for instance, the adoption lag in the year of invention has gone down from the terms of decades to the terms of single-digit years, and that's very interesting. Now, how has technology changed during that time period? So at the top right, they have technology. So the red line is it reliant on academic research? That's red, less so in the last 30 years or so. Is it easy to update? Oh, very important since about 1960 to have technology that you have different iterations on. And reliant on complex supply chains, very cyclical. So in the World War II era, complex supply chains. In the 90s, less complex supply chains, a surge toward the complex international systems we have today. And then, of course, COVID happened and we suddenly decided to went, whoa, supply chains issues. And how has tech changed on the bottom right? So we've dramatically increased worker productivity. That used to be the big issue with it. Yes. But then nowadays, that maybe is 25% of tech. Reliant on network effects is 30%. And this personal characteristic, which I enjoy the most, the inventor was highly eccentric, remaining relatively consistent over the last 200 years. So Scott says for the Innovation Station paper, its title is GPT as a measurement tool. I was just out of puns and it was late. Did How much reliance did the authors place on GPT as a measurement tool? Oh, lots. That's it comes down to it, Scott. Indeed, lots. But they did. It's an interesting paper. Take a look at it. The US continues to promote fewer to no guardrails in AI innovation, which makes too easy the garbage in, garbage out of such systems. I will say, though, I don't know the last time I've reviewed a paper in academia that doesn't look like at least, I don't know, half of it was AI written, possibly more. And so it's so ubiquitous in our field. And the number of papers being submitted to journals has increased. The number of papers submitted to conferences has increased. It's crazy. And Jochen says, I wonder if this was the inventor is eccentric or the person that customers uses associate with the product, like Woz versus Jobs. Very good point. The eccentric one, it's Woz. Who doesn't love Woz? And then it's Steve Jobs. I'm going to wear a turtleneck and have very strong opinions about things. And Melanie, how is eccentric defined? That is a question that only an eccentric would ask. Appreciate that so much. How do you define eccentric? I don't know. A great question. how do you define whether inventor A was an eccentric but not inventor B? Like what level of it's a great question to ask. Like were they I'm using a, was it like, oh, I'm wearing a bunch of soap as a hat or something else, or was it something, what are the tells for eccentricity is a great question. I like your reviewer B approach to this because I would ask the same question. I could look in the paper, but I just was looking at the pretty charts. Jochen says no matter how you measure, its unit just must be the absolutely positively connotated Feynman. I understand that and I love that, Jochen. A minus. Good work. So, where are we now? So let's talk about this. Let's talk a little bit about tariffs for a second. I promised some tariff action from some folks who wanted an update. So, let's talk about core CPI inflation when adjusted for tariff pass-throughs and government distortions. Okay, so the addition of additional data allowed Goldman Sachs to actually produce some very interesting tariff-related charts and data. And so they have some very highly paid, very competent economists working for them. And the chart at the in the right here looks like the actual inflation rate and then the inflation rate that it would be excluding tariffs. And so they're estimating that on average throughout the July 25 and to July 26 period, the one we're in right now, that tariffs are adding about 0.7% to our inflation in a given year. Like right now, our true inflation would actually have already hit the 2% or under level. And I do agree with this analysis. It is substantially well done, and it does indicate what we've been seeing from producers that it is following through. And we'll look at another chart that examines whether those prices are falling through to higher levels for us. There's a lot of issues with tariffs. We know they increase prices when they're passed along to consumers. And the level of tariffs become important because the greater they are, of course, the greater this differential. But we do see that it is responsible for it. And so it is likely that the Fed would probably be in a different position regarding lowering the rates than they have been. We would have hit that 1.9 or 2% number if we just didn't have these pesky tariffs with us. If it wasn't for these pesky kids, we'd be great. And then on the left, we've got tariff effects on monthly core CPI inflation. And so there is saying, well, it's about 0.7% on average per month. But then the tariffs will go away, says Goldman, and they're going to go away. And if they do go away, according to Goldman, optimistic times ahead, and we expect, therefore, that will help lower the Goldman Sachs estimate of where inflation is going to be next year to around 2%, which should pave the way for greater Fed cuts the following year, which means cheaper prices all around for everybody. But let's see what happens. A lot can happen in a year. So let's see. So now let's talk about some. Oh, Michael says, is there a legitimate measure of fiscal benefit? So, Michael, the obvious one, of course, is that we bring in money. That's a good question to the tune of a couple $100 billion with the tariffs that have come in so far. It is when we look at the aggregate size of the U.S. economy, among other things, it is still paid for by it is a tax primarily to the consumer. And so the question is then, what does the government do with that money? You could also argue more geopolitically in a nuanced sense if it is being used as a policy tool. I mean, I'm not saying all tariffs are diabolical. There are trade-offs with tariffs. In our last year and a half in particular, or last year, where we've done very aggressive amounts of tariffs that we haven't seen in some time, does more harm, in my opinion, and the opinion of most economic research, than good. But tariffs in general can be strategic. They, for instance, could protect nascent industries from international competition, but use them sparingly and use them wisely. Albert says, any thoughts on the new Fed chair that'll come in? Will he listen to Trump on lowering rates and when he wants them? I didn't talk about this time, but I go back to a chart I showed last month, 2 months ago. Basically, the idea is we've studied the effects of what happens when a Fed becomes less independent and there's more government intervention, and it's never good. And so, if Trump is indeed hiring a yes person for this role, as the new Fed chair is, and the new Fed chief is very interesting. So, I've been following or the new proposed Fed chief is very interesting because I've been following some of his older stuff. And there's been some economists that have known him, and Warsh is an interesting guy because he has this like Morgan Stanley and Hoover, and he was at Stanford for a while background, and he's done a bunch of things that are interesting. But from a policy perspective, like he's a competent enough person, you're like, this could be an economist. And when somebody presents themselves as a candidate where I believe we could lower rates versus being now taking over the position and saying there's going to be all this data coming their way, all this analysis, and they have to make sound judgments on this. That difference between theoretically being for something and being on the job and asked to do it are two different things. But if it's true that he lowers rates faster than would otherwise happen, there is that risk that inflation will come crawling back, and that's tough. That's a tough question to do. And so Powell has truly threaded the needle. I didn't have a huge amount of expectations for Powell, but he surprised me very pleasantly through his management and stewardship, as well as his ability to keep the Fed independent, as it should be from the federal government, whoever is president. Um, and this is interesting. So I think it is more likely with lower rates in those cases, but I think he's still going to be confounded by the same issues that are confounding the current chair. And I have to believe fundamentally that somebody with that level of education and experience takes data into some consideration when making these decisions. So whatever the promise is made, I doubt it will be as award worthy for Trump as I think he wants. Now, terrifying expenditures. Consumers are paying for tariffs mostly, but there's a difference in this. And so this little article written up here from some researchers, they found that about 90% on the left of tariffs' economic burden fell on U.S. firms and consumers. Okay, 90%. Let's look at some other data here, a different source. So far in the current data, it's estimated that there is somewhat less pass through to consumers than we see in other places. About 80% in this case, the other left says 90, 80% is the one on the right, go to US businesses and US consumers, about 20% to foreign exporters. And that could be, there's some hesitation. Foreign exporters, of course, who want access to US markets are willing to absorb some of that price differential. And this is usually, though, unsustainable in the long run. So we'll see what happens. But in 1819, foreign exporters paid nothing, and consumers paid about 70%, with businesses the remainder. And so it's an interesting documentation. And I want to point out that an 80-20 ratio of consumer businesses to foreign still is terrible. And it's still it's bad for us. It's bad for a lot of reasons. But okay, Reilly, I hear you on tariffs. Let's talk about this differently. So, another article that looked at, and these are not my highlights. I know they look like it was drawn by a 3-year-old and going, "Ugh, I got to run this." And it would be probably more adept than I would be at handling a highlighter, although I have many of them. They're primarily decorative. Beyond tariffs, a better approach to green industrial policy. So, this looks at tariffs imposed by the US on Chinese solar panel imports since 2012. So what happened when you put tariffs on solar imports, right, to protect the solar industry in the United States? Chinese firms relocated production to countries that weren't subject to tariffs. Still Chinese solar panels, different countries. The result was higher solar panel prices in the US and a decline in employment and wages in the solar industry relative to where they would be without it. And so, first of all, Figure 1 shows Chinese firms exposed to tariffs offshored production, and solar prices increased relative to other markets, even though that generally speaking, we looked at the collapse of prices for solar in that time period. The US collapse wasn't as great, and the amount we were paying for panels was greater, primarily because of these tariffs. And so they don't really do a good job. And furthermore, in the bottom right, and this little screenshot I grabbed for you, the tariffs not only also reduced total U.S. employment and wages in the solar industry, installation and related sectors lost more jobs than manufacturing gained. Isn't that the case? So you protect manufacturing, but then you lose installation jobs. You protect 40 workers over here, 200 workers get laid off over here. That's how tariffs work. And that is the bummer in it. And I apologize that I am now blurry, but that's okay. That's good. It's your eyes. It's not me. It's one of those things. It's an eye test. Are you seeing okay? Is Reilly A or Reilly B? The result contradicts a common justification that solar tariffs protect domestic jobs. Good paper, good writing on this. Game of whack-a-mole. So you don't believe me? Let's ask our good friend Joe Politano. As Aaron points out, we are a value-adding trade country, not a goods manufacturing state. Not yet. I too pine for the days where I can work back in the mills of my ancestors. Year-on-year change in U.S. blue-collar employment. So is this helping blue-collar workers? Let's look at this. Is this helping the people that it is designed to protect? And as it turns out, it is not. Manufacturing in particular down significantly in the last 2 years, and it's terrible. Construction, a bright spot, also down, and construction also hit with additional labor shortages in the last half year, as construction labor is one of the most exposed, of course, to immigrant labor. Mining, logging, oil, and gas also down. Utilities, they're up, they're doing okay a little bit. And total blue collar employment growth, also kind of a bummer. Melanie says, wait, I thought all of us with kids taking 16 AP classes in high school were supposed to send them to trade school instead of uni. There is a lot of demand for it. And one day, you look at this, and Melanie, that's a good question. Do you send your child with all the AP things, and you're like, okay, are they taking AP HVAC, you might ask? And we do need workers in these areas. And the hard part is the infrastructure, the apprenticeships, the availability of subcontractors. There's a lot of issues here. But right now, it is as tough for blue collar workers, if not tougher, than it is for some aspects of the white collar industry. And we're seeing a lot of white collar jobs have been disappointing, have had disappointing growth as well. And that's fascinating. This one gives me pause, Albert says, because aren't high schoolers foregoing college to enter the trades? If trades aren't growing, we're all getting squeezed. It is a universal squeeze on this. AP HVAC would be very welcome. Let's teach it. This is the issue too, right? This is the fundamental issue with this states. We say blue collar, but there is it is not sunshine, rainbows, unicorns in every industry. And all, as a whole, again, apart from the expansion and readying expansion of the healthcare industry, it has been depressing for everybody. But you might say, wait a second. Let's talk even more about manufacturing employment. So let's look at another great Joe Politano chart. Manufacturing, of course, down in the last 2 years, really down for wood, paper, and printing. So my printers here, where are my Gutenbergs in the house? Machinery down, computer electronics down, chemicals down, food, it's relatively stable, transportation equipment down, and metals slightly up in non-metallic minerals. So if you're starting your non-metallic mineral manufacturing industry, this is the golden age. But it's also highly open to cyclical prices. So of course, this little bump in metals and non-metallic minerals, absolutely the commodity price, the price surges we've seen in precious metals in the last few months. And then the crash. Silver has been a ride. I like to, it's interesting. One of my Reilly nerd hobbies is I'm a big numismatist. I love old coins, old silver, all that stuff. But not like, I don't put the big bucks open. I don't have a cherished $40,000 so-and-so over here. But I go to a local guy and he doesn't see things. He sees things only through the lens in his coin shop of like what the actual silver is worth. And I haven't bought anything in the last 6 months because the prices have been prohibitively expensive. You've been following the unique price demands on silver in the ups and downs of the last 8 months. It has been a ride. It has been tremendous. And so I would go over there and I'd say, "Oh, what do you got?" He's like, "Do you want these?" Because the people come in and they buy the American silver this, and I want stuff. I want old stuff. I want 1800s, 1700s. I want stuff from the 5th century BC, so I can bring it to it. And I have, I used to pass around when I teach the intro graduate classes in finance. I do a finance history lecture, and I used to pass around this 5th century BC Greek coin. And it got lost in the carpets because it was tiny and made of bronze. And so then they destroyed my building. And so my hope is, and my ongoing joke is that in 2,000 years' time, an archaeologist uncovers these buried coins in New Mexico, and it completely distorts a future PhD thesis. I'm very, very optimistic that'll happen. So let's talk a little bit about houses for a second, and let's bring it back to the Bay Area for some shenanigans. So home price shifts since 1975. So if you bought in San Francisco in 1975, when you were young or not born, or a sparkle in your parents' eyes, or maybe if you're younger generation, this is your great grandparents, in 1975. So if you bought a house there, you would see still in the San Francisco, Oakland, and dare I say Fremont area, a 2,293% increase. 23-fold increase in the value of your real estate. The national value of real estate's up 10%. But then if you invested in places like Youngstown, Ohio, you're only going to see an actual increase in value of about 480%. Where it is important. Now let's put that in your pipe and smoke it. And then on the right side, you've got the change in prices. Actually, the change in 15 of the nation's 50 largest metro area housing markets in January 2026 had more active housing inventory for sale than in January 2019. There are more houses for sale now than there were in these markets last year. But it's not a huge number. And if you look at, and there are areas which we've seen the greatest growth in building and also the greatest decrease in price. And so if we look at this, we're looking at places like San Antonio and Denver and Austin, places that built a lot of housing. And as a consequence, they've seen those prices come down a bit in value too. And their argument is like, oh, they overbuilt, but they also then they did actually build. And so when you do build, prices do come down or have the capacity of coming down. But this one looks at housing markets in particular, the active inventory for sale. And you don't see a lot of things. It's tough to find here, but right there, kind of in the middle, it's kind of an eye test. You won't be able to read it probably, but right in the middle is San Francisco and then San Jose, Sunnyvale, down about 22% in active inventory since pre-pandemic. And lower inventory means lower churn, and it also keeps prices from adjusting accordingly. What's funny, Aaron says, if you bought in 2005, you did okay in the last 20 years, but not better than the S&P 500. And this, Aaron brings up a great point, right? It's all about the opportunity cost. You could say, oh, I bought this house in San Francisco and it's great and it's been doing well. And I know it has for most people where the store of wealth lies. But at that same time period, if your opportunity cost is taking that same money and putting in the markets, you would have done even better. And that is, I think, a very key observation. Now, let's talk about construction in general. So we know that places that build a lot more have greater price adjustments, greater price decreases, as you can see. The other side of this issue is residential construction payrolls. The amount of people out there, and this is a little bit one of those, this is one of those deceitful charts designed to show changes. Big fan of them to use them on presentations, but look at that left, always look at the axes. It goes from 3,240,000 to 3,380,000. But residential construction payrolls have remained relatively stable and in fact have declined somewhat, where non-residential construction has continued to plod along. And there is, of course, finite labor, and labor moves where capital is being deployed in different ways to build stuff. And as a consequence, we're seeing more stuff going into building non-residential than residential at a time when we often need greater residential capacity in highly density urban areas where people have jobs. Melanie says prices in San Francisco barely dropped after the '89 quake. I was talking to my cousin about that recently because she was, they have my old dad's family's from the Bay Area, and I know where I was at that time, but they were but she remembered that quake really well in '89. And and there was, of course, it is amazing to see that it was nothing. It was not even a blip, as Melanie points out in '89. And that's actually it's really surprising actually, but it didn't stop the benefit. What really actually incidentally altered it more was the first recession that we had back in 1990 across the country, and that slowed down some of that price appreciation. And then, of course, with the advent of the tech boom, you had, prices started surging drastically. So it's been fascinating to see. So anyway, let's talk about home value to income ratio. And of course, if you're asking, what's the Bay Area, Riley? And I'm like, it's 10 to 12, depending on which part of the Bay Area that you're in. But nationally, it's about 4. And 4 doesn't seem like a really big number. I know Aaron's like, oh, the '90 recession, that was real. It was artisan. That was when recessions were recessions. um, and the price to income ratio right now is about 4.2. Slight improvement over just a couple years back in 2022, where it peaked at 4.6. But if we go back in time, it is one of the higher such ratios we've had. And it's right now still at some of the highest levels we saw in 2006 and above kind of our long term mean. And this is, again, a little deceiving for a few reasons. One, I'm not showing the mortgage rates that are here. But also note the mortgage rates have come up substantially in the last few years and are comparable to where we were, say, in the early to mid 90s. But of course, that price to income ratio, the home value to income ratio, was better then. And so we have not built as much in the last 25 years that we could have done, and that's contributed to this explosive rise in prices. So construction productivity, another thing to talk about. Why is stuff expensive? Why is it so hard to build something in this country? Why is it expensive in the United States to build anything, in fact? And as it turns out, if we look at productivity as a thing, speaking of Baumol's cost disease, the economy overall, productivity has kept pace with technology. Construction is one of a few industries are in this bucket where actual factor productivity is lower than where it was back in 1960. Indeed, half as much. And then it's been going down and continues to drop. The way we build, the method of building, the labor required to build, all are very expensive. It's the equivalency of having household servants or an orchestra. It's a weird luxury that we don't have an answer for. But something like building is so important. And the cost of building then has gone up and we've gotten less for it. And so when we look at questions of productivity, if you're developing technology and you have everything from, say, machine manufactured homes to those material printed cement homes as alternatives, consider things that are technologically advanced like that as part of the solution for getting us around this, because they're avoiding a lot of the labor costs that have dragged the industry in an interesting way. We're basically in the 1940s, as Aaron points out, and it's true. And at least in the 1940s, you had less demands. And I showed this Financial Times thing on the top right, and this is a shout out specifically to the Bay Area. Normally each one of these, you're tired of these charts showing how expensive stuff is, but I got some good news for you. London builds less than the Bay Area. Oh, yay! We're not numbers. You're not the worst. House building in London has collapsed to historic low, not seen anywhere else in the developed world. Notice that right above London is San Francisco, but it's worse in London right now, and I thought you should know that. Meanwhile, New York, even New York is better. Paris just rocking and rolling. In Melbourne, it's magical the amount of housing they're even building there. And so not near my flat. NNF. NNMF. Great cap expectations. So this came up a few times here. Oh, look at this. Oh, good question. Aaron with a lead in, not even knowing what the next slide was going to be. Zero ROI on CapEx, no investment in this. We need massive consolidation of hundreds of thousands of builders to 10,000 builders to scale and attract this. So here's the thing. I know you might look at Aaron's statements. Aaron is speaking the truth here as a solution. But again, bold policy idea requires bold political will. And everybody is like a limp noodle when it comes down to questions about making policy decisions. But Aaron points out zero ROI on CapEx. Consolidation of builders. Why hasn't that happened? Local regulations and laws and different theories abound as to why this is this way. But we have so many, it is dominated by small home builders that have local expertise in markets where they can navigate complex permitting structures. And so we do need consolidation in the industry. Economies of scale that happen in other industries aren't happening in construction, particularly residential construction, for these reasons. And Jochen says, I wonder if London in this chart refers to London or Greater London, of course. And if it's the former, they simply have the same issue as San Francisco. I know, I don't think they mean just the square mile of the old city. I think they are talking about the Greater London here, but that is worth looking at. You can't already overbuild what's already there. It is true, and there are different historical districts to talk about, but I will say, anything too. And this is always a balance too. And it's actually unique. And it's not even, this isn't a European phenomenon. Paris, of course, can also demonstrate greater, has a more robust building market and a more robust ratio as a result of this. And it's fascinating to point out, but London and Anglophone countries, and some people, and there's all this talk, is this English common law? Is it a litigious nature? Is it the question of why are all these countries hard to build in? And yet Melbourne, of course, has been able to have a greater rate of build despite being an Anglophone country. It's a lot of interesting questions on this one. That's absolutely true. Melanie says, nobody will believe me, but London was rather affordable when I lived there in the 80s. Oh, in the 80s in London, Melanie, That is a tale. That sounds fun. Weave us more tales of 80s London. Albert says, does the UK have their own CEQA Act? That's a fascinating question. They do have some rigid restrictions on building, but it's a great question. House building is expensive here, as Michael points out, as his late father said, because of overregulation, and regulators are in the pocket of the building industry. And that's true. Overregulation is often designed to have the best intentions at mind, but they have all of these other effects that go along with them. And Yokin says, just like San Francisco, London has so much to offer, it's much easier to bite the cost bullet compared to many other cheaper places. Maximus unleashed building hell. I know, very good. Russell Crowe. Nice. Russell Crowe builds every house in Melbourne. Uh, all AI-driven capex nears record highs right now. Okay, let's talk about this. So this chart has been floating around, and people are like, "What does it mean? And can you interpret this?" And on the left, so if you look at some of the big players, your Oracle, your Meta, your Google, your Amazon, your Microsoft, all your delightful local firms, you notice that free cash flow, right? So after you take the money that company makes and what we call the free cash flow measure, which is often used as an alternative demonstrator of profitability, especially when I ask my students to value a company, they're using free cash flow projections, right? And free cash flow fell off a cliff in the last year. And what is free cash flow used for? There's a choice, right? And firms have a choice. Do they hold on to the money? And they might hold on to the money to buy back stock and do other silly things like that. They might, but they should. We want firms to invest in future growth. And lo, that is what they've done. In the last year, firms have taken that free cash flow that they're making and plowed it into AI like there's no tomorrow. And so you've seen this drop off at this level. So the question is, and so this is good on the right hand side, BC Alpha did some research around this. Is the return strategy when we've had other situations where we've just gone choo choo, hop on the capital expenditure wagon towards investment. We know that CapEx should pay off. We know that investment in that technology is often, or new technologies, buildings, plants, anything else we need builds capacity of a firm. Does it pay off in the long run? And so as it turns out, we go back in time and we do a return strategy on the market. And the return of a strategy, which goes long on stocks, you buy stocks that invest a lot and you sell stocks that don't invest a lot. So you go short on these low investment companies. You actually find a really depressing return in the last 50 years or so overall. You see some bright spots in this. You see some returns, and this isn't deceiving because it is a running tally since about 1960. But when you look at the focus on this. When returns go up first and then they fall off a cliff, like in the dot-com bubble. So returns were better for companies. So it started going up again. So it was already down 60% since 1960 in the 90s. And then people started invest. Oh, prices went up, and then you had a crash and it went down again. And then you get prices going up, and then COVID crash, and then, all these things. So the investment strategy overall doesn't pay off over 60 years, but individually it's an opportunity to make some money. But where are we on this cycle is the question. And will this result in a fall off for us in the future? And Michael says, this is a good point. For example, there are comparatively fewer BART stations in the Bay Area. There's so much more expensive to build than normal subway stations because they have a useless plaza floor between the street and the tracks. Very interesting story, too. And I've ridden the BART as much as the average bear when I'm in the Bay Area, and I enjoy having it, and it's a good thing, but it's also to the point underdeveloped in the sense of where it could be for a city of this density or an area of this density, and that's fascinating. And Albert says that these charts correlate with the AI bubble. So the left is about the AI bubble. On the right, we will find out, and so we actually see. And this is the hard part here. Don't. This is a running return since 1960. So when there is an upslope, you are making money, even though you're down from 1960 in this investment strategy. And so right now, we have seen that growth recognized in this market in the bottom right-hand side of that graph. But again, it's leveled off. And the question is, as history shows us, it produces more losers than winners over time, which is the big picture. And so in that perspective, we will see how this pans out from an investment standpoint. And then I decided, let me add something nobody asked for in this, because I had all these charts, and I'm like, you know what, these charts need a thing. Let's talk about farm bankruptcies. I know you're waiting for this one. I know I've got people on the deck here who've been waiting for this for 6 years. Give me the farm bankruptcies. We've got somebody up in, Eureka, growing. They're like it's a redwood cannabis farm. And they're like, tell me about this. What's happening? And so, first of all, this is interesting to note that the Chapter 12 farm bankruptcies have been on the rise. And in fact, what's going on in Arkansas, Albert? That's what I said. There's 33 in Arkansas, 27 in Georgia, and a whole slew of these. There are indeed more farms in these areas than there are in, say, other places in the country, but 17 in California. But look at the year-on-year change, as Albert points out. This has been increasing, particularly in the center part of the country. And the key to this chart to understand why farm bankruptcies are going up, look at the farm borrowers' profitability per region. Back in 2022, about 80% of all farmers were making money. That's fell to about 50% now across the country. And that leads a lot more farms are in dire straits because farm consolidation can be bad news for food supply. Tariffs affect this. They are not helping, and a whole bunch of other issues involving farming in the country and our food supplies. So it is a huge issue. And I have that's interesting. Soybean farms in Arkansas. I have found all my travels through one of my other Reilly hobbies is I'm trying to visit all 3,144 counties and equivalents in the country. And I'm a big fan of visiting. So I spend a lot of time when I have my limited free time driving in very strange rural areas. Arkansas produces a lot of rice, incidentally, but it also produces soybeans and chickens. They've got a lot of chicken farms as well as cotton. And so they have, tens of thousands of farms. Let me look up the number here. It looks like they have around 40,000 farms or so in Arkansas. So a large number, but there's more of this. In Tyson, I know, chicken farms. Can you believe this? But actually, it's interesting. A very cyclical industry. So it went down after COVID bankruptcies, but they're coming up again. And we'll see how this pans out. Now, this is good. Wisconsin, Scott, of course. Scott, representing Wisconsin here. Wisconsin also particularly hard hit in this places. 16 farm bankruptcies in 2025. You had only two the prior year. And I'm glad you added this link too about this because I'd love to know a little bit more about the Wisconsin story and why they are particularly hard hit. And it says, it's interesting. So farms and fisheries, blah blah blah, and you've got this. Oh, Wisconsin, they're using the same charts. This is good. And so look at that. Interesting stuff. Good article, Scott. I appreciated this as well. This is good. So, yeah, borrowing is up and profitability is down. Absolutely interesting. This is just cool. But keep an eye on this. We'll see how this is happening. And C, I think I read that it's monopolies that are shafting farmer. It is tough. It is a tough industry and highly asset intensive, which means there's a lot of debt that goes into financing this to ensure profitability. So, and when there are issues with this, what happens? We see farm consolidation into larger corporate farm structures in these areas. And so that could also continue to happen. And so S&P 500. I'm going to go quickly in the last few slides here talking about the markets right now. And this is an interesting chart because this is showing the percent of companies right now in the last couple of weeks that are trading at 52-week highs. The highest in the last year is in red. 4-week highs is in blue. And so IT, so the red is the really interesting figure. What percent of companies are trading near their year highs? Only 9% in information technology, but 41% of energy companies are near all-time highs in the last year, I should say. 27% of materials and about 28% of industrials. And so for those of you who are trading right now and looking at markets, it is fascinating. Large and corporate, I agree, Melanie. The family farm in California, whatever it was and whatever it existed, it's a very different place now. I mean, the Central Valley is one giant, it's one giant place, and so it's a thing. And another thing to look at, all the giant farms, all the thousands and thousands of acres of almonds, rare recessions, recession frequencies dropped over time. So it used to be we used to have recessions all the time. 19th century, every year was a panic. The panic of this year, wait a couple years, another panic. It's become rare to have recessions. And is this good or bad? And so on one hand, you're like, oh, that's good, but the recessions tend to be more recessive. So periods of expansion have grown longer. If we look at the business cycle expansion, the last few cycles have been incredibly long. The longest, of course, ranging from 2009 all the way up until COVID in 2020. And then with the brief COVID recession, 2020 to today, still, there is no guarantee that a recession will happen this year or next year, but generally it will happen. But the terms between our expansionary periods have been getting much longer. An interesting observation. And we also have a couple of comments people always asked about the uh, the price of the value of the U.S. dollar. So international trade is very the U.S. dollar is the cornerstone still of international trade, dating back to the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, which made the U.S. dollar the only currency convertible to gold, but then priced everything like commodities such as oil in dollars. And then in the 1970s, even after the gold standard broke down globally, people still kept dollars in there in as reserves. It still was the global reserve currency. It still is the global reserve currency. And the value of the dollar, and as you might expect, while relatively high last year, has been declining for most of our large trading partners right across the board. One benefit is we're basically flat on the New Zealand dollar since August of 25, but it's gone down across the board for a lot of this. And it is your biggest manifestation of this is it becomes more expensive to travel internationally. As Albert points out, not everywhere. Japan is incredibly cheap to visit. When I visited in 2024, I felt like I was the richest man alive. I'm like, yes, let's stay in another, my fancy, $80, hotel room was a luxury. California, yeah, and that's true. And across the board, and especially during the last month or two, this has accelerated. And I'll take two of those square watermelons. Uh, and this is interesting because in a lot of ways, with currency is a fascinating thing. When people demand more US products, they have to buy those products in US dollars, and that drives up the price of the dollar relative to other things. When people want US products or services less, or they want to invest in the United, or they don't want to invest as much in the United States because they're worried about trade or geopolitical ramifications, this is the effect of lowering the value of the dollar. And we're seeing a lot of these effects happen in real time. The US attracted a lot of investment, it attracted a lot of interest in the last years. We are focused too much on imports, exports, and trade policy, but the big story is really about the investment that happens between other countries in the United States. And we're perceived to be, of course, a store of value, much like even Japan is in some respects. But in that sense, we are losing that shine in the last year. And this will have ramifications down the line. It will depend how temporal these situations are. Michael says, I hear that farm consolidation is a big handout to big ag as individual farms are forced to sell. It is true. Farm consolidation has been the norm rather than something unusual. We've seen the average farm size increase drastically in response to this. It used to be, nowadays, and let me get the right number here. It used to be let's see, the median farm size is still around 72 acres. The average farm size is about 466 acres because it's dominated by some very, very large farms. They're often 5,000 acres plus. And those of you who might be 640 acres is a square mile. So these are giant, giant farms, and they're very, very absolutely astonishing to look at. And concluding on that note, but I'm not quite done yet. Oh, yes. Why is the Swedish krona so strong versus the dollar? That's a good question. Or whether the Norwegian krona is so strong versus the dollar. It's strong relative to its previous position. I mean, it isn't. I wouldn't say that it is necessarily itself a valuable currency, but the trajectory since 2025 has been really outstanding. It was only 9 cents back in January of last year. Now it's 11 cents. Ooh, it's crazy. So it's a thing. More krona, less problems. So we'll see how this pans out. All right, so take a look at this. If I'm not connected with you on LinkedIn, please connect with me. I enjoy hearing from you. I don't post a lot, but I probably should. But it's good. And if you need any recommendations or job support or whimsical links or anything, never hesitate to reach out. I have a couple other questions I have to address that Albert sent me that I didn't have time to build into the presentation yesterday. And so people asked, so number one, what's the outlook for tech? People are talking about an AI bubble and a crash anticipated. My thought is that we're going to see how this pans out with this investment in AI. Firms are behaving as you might expect in a bubbly environment. You have a new technology that's dominant with a lot of promise. Some of this promise will bear fruit. Much of it will not bear fruit in the way that people expect it will. I expect there will be an adjustment in the next couple of years in this, but it doesn't mean it's bad news for tech. The key is, though, the key is to understand is even if you're in a like the last few years, I mean, the last 2 years in particular have been rough, right? So there's a lot of hiring in COVID. There was over hiring. People started with the layoffs in mass 2 years ago. And now the focus is on the physical manifestation of AI technology rather than the personal component. And I think there will be a shift back to the person side. And I don't know whether that's going to be sooner or later. And I mean, it'll be interesting. I know Colin will disagree with me about this too, because it's a very rosy picture when you look at questions about AI. But I think it's going to be at least for the next year. There's no guarantee that this AI bubble will crash, and the way that it crashes won't. It'll sap up investment that'll be there, and it will take some time to recover, even if it's a moderate level of deflation. Is it now a good time to change jobs? The question is there a job in hand? And so this is interesting. It is a low hire environment, but it's also a low fire environment. Now, this depends on the industry. It's slightly higher risk in info tech if you're in that sector. And so, but I would say that looking at the question of changing jobs, it's a matter of the contract. It's a matter of understanding the business, what they do, and what their trajectory is. And you have to take out the rose-colored glasses when looking at a question of a new job, because changing a job is always a risk. You go from one environment where you control, and whatever you are at that previous job, all those soft factors that you might have built up for years that have given you certain noblesse oblige, so to speak, when you walk around and, preferential treatment at the water cooler or whatever it might be. But just that ability to have that personal capital does go away. And you then have to re-demonstrate that. And so you have to weigh pay, you have to weigh support, company direction in the nature of a very changing, but a very dynamic market. But I would say that people now, that the tendency of that COVID era job shifting has backed away, and people are sticking around longer because there's a little bit more fear in this economy. And so it's a question of the type of company you're going to. And for you individually, there is, in the aggregate scope of life, there are greater rewards. When we look at the question of are people better off when they leave and change positions versus staying in the same role, and most research has shown at least that there is benefits to leaving. And so do take that into consideration. Has the economy quantitatively improved after 1 year of Trump 2.0? No. That's a good question. I spent a lot of time talking about this. It has not. But I would say that the GDP, so let me rephrase that. GDP right now is up in the sense that the amount of the value of the products and services we produce is going up. But with the other metrics of the economy, everything from consumer sentiment down to other aspects of just the overall economic situation is not from the data we're seeing, even though consumer spending has held up in higher income areas, the drop off that we've seen or started to see in some of the low income areas is interesting. We've looked at the higher tariffs are taking a toll. But I think that at the same time, the lower taxes are creating a greater benefit. You'll probably get a higher than usual tax. If you've done your taxes, I've done my taxes, you'll get a bigger refund than last year probably. But we're also in a greater fiscal hole than we were before in terms of our GDP. So it depends on the lens through which you look at it. We can always find a good thing and a bad thing in every economy. But overall, there are concerns. I think how will AI impact the job market for the rest of the year? It's going to continue to be a risk, but we're not seeing firms in mass do things like I'm laying off people for this. I know this is a debate, right? Did Amazon lay off 16,000 people for the sake of just AI? I think every cut that firms will be making are going to be viewed under an AI lens in the next year. But whether that's true or not is highly dependent on things. I think there is right now concern over tariffs and volatility in the market, and there's concern over uncertainties and geopolitical realities, and that's keeping firms from investing in a lot of the stuff they might otherwise do. And I think once we arrive at some level of certainty, that would produce, I think, for me at least, the boundaries for creating a more dynamic economy. And I think any thoughts on how the US and perhaps retailers would address a returned refund of collected tariffs? So that's interesting. And so that's fun. So that is, I think, something that is on deck. that if, especially if the economy goes south, I think the GOP and Trump will probably seek some type of direct cash payment to individuals, and that will produce a a mild to moderate economic bump, I think, because people typically will spend that money, or they might pay down a credit card or whatever they're going to do with it, and that has been shown in the past to increase or improve different aspects of the economy, even when done at a minor level back when we were looking at the quantitative easing in 2009, 2010, as well as the COVID stimulus packages. Both are interesting. But the other question is, will they then take a tariff driving inflationary income and give that back to consumers and potentially, you know, keep driving inflation? So anyway, we should all focus on Olympic curling. That's right. Don't poke. Don't be, don't over Canadian it. Bitcoin down to 66,000. I know. What a time to buy. I'm writing a paper about that now, actually, which is interesting. Uh, your investment is over the hog line. Diana says, wondering if it's easier to find part-time contract work now. So this is an interesting question, Diana, because it's also being competitive. So sapped up places. I have my own little Reilly a consulting firm, and it's shenanigans. I know for a fact that some of the work I'm doing in this side hustle is something that might be taking away from a potential full-time job, particularly at municipalities and other places. And that is something. And I'm doing it for a bit less money, but than somebody who's full-time will do it for. But it is something that's still fiscally beneficial. So I think that in short, I think Diana, part-time contract work is more common now. And I think that firms often finding uncertainty in situations are finding it easier and more flexible to hire contract work. But a lot of the contract work, as we found out, and we talked about this in God, 6 months ago or whenever in the BLS standards, people ask the same question, and a lot of it just isn't picked up the same way in the data. And so that's also ish. Albert's this curling tournament. Yeah, Bitcoin can crash and clean out the 100 times leverage mark. Aaron's like the voice inside my head that says things, and I'm like, do I say this thing? All right, go, Albert. Go. What do you got? How's it
How
going?
many of your peers and say like at the University of New Mexico have their own podcast or Substack and
Oh,
try to make money off of that too in their personal brands, right? University of New Mexico
yeah.
probably doesn't prevent you from building a personal brand if you want, because after all, you're here.
I know. What is this? Is this my brand? This is my brand.
This
What
is
do you
your
mean?
brand, yeah.
No, actually, it is funny. So we are
People
allowed,
tell
if
me
you're
they
on
love the way you present, but it's the numbers that, make them
if
depressed.
you're
And that's not your fault. That's
It's
everybody else.
so one of the things universities build in consulting days as part of your contract. So if you, for instance, run a 9 month contract, like not, if you're a regular professor, not an administrator who gave your life and soul to work all summer to bureaucracy like I've done. If you work 9 month contracts, you get 39 consulting days that you can spend in that time period, which is a big number, right? So that's
Yeah.
over a full month of consulting. And if you look at like billable hours and things like that's a great, you can really, I know some faculty do enough personal branding in different capacity through consulting at all that they do really well. And so if you've got a municipality looking for fiscal projections or anything else on the docket, contact Erebor LLC. Reilly White. But bump,
So
give
what
me
do
a
we
pitch.
watch in the next? So our next webinar is March the 12th, which doesn't seem that far away, but I guess, however way you look at it. What do we want to look for between now and then, right? I think the Fed met
Okay.
today. We have President Trump's State of the Union next Tuesday night. We
Yeah.
have another jobs report coming our way as well, with probably more downward revisions. And the AI just continues getting even
Okay.
better. So,
The three eyes. All right. So we're going to be looking at inflation. We're going to be looking at indicators, and we're going to be looking at Iran. And so there's
mm.
three things. So let's talk about them and what those mean. I had to think of something. I was trying to think of some alliteration to make this
And the
work.
new Fed gets
So
installed in May, so that'll be exciting when we do that.
exactly. So right now, so we expect inflation will be, yes, exactly, MC, May. And that's going to be interesting. So that's right now, markets are still showing very little change in the expected end of year drops in our interest rates, and that may change. They've been very bad at predicting this recently, but market consensus is still that the number of rate cuts we'll see this year are very low. Now, inflation's key because, of course, we know that inflation is what the Fed is responding to mostly when it does that change in its discount rate, the one rate that it controls. Overnight lending to big banks, a ripple effect on the rest of the economy. And they increase rates when they're worried about inflation because it increases the cost of doing business, the cost of loans. It helps decrease the monetary supply and control inflation. And they decrease it when they want to jumpstart the economy. They're under pressure to decrease it, to make stuff cheaper for loans and increase economic growth. I think they're going to have a couple of cuts, but it's going to be dependent on the progress that we make on the inflation side. If we get some certainty around some of that, on some of those tariffs, and those might go away, or they're temporal, or whether they stay forever, this is always the debate, right? And so if it is part of our long-term economic policy, I see fewer cuts than if it would be if they dropped, as Morgan was showing in a small bit tomorrow. And the next bit, of course, is indicators, growth indicators. Look at the GDP numbers, the jobs reports, the CPI data. Q1 2026 won't be out for a couple months, but that's going to be important for us to really gauge how well we're doing. I think I'm very interested in our first quarter number, as we look at things like tariff impacts and corporate AI investment and all that stuff. And that third piece, Iran's interesting because geopolitical. When I mean that, I mean geopolitical risk. And so when you look at these things, you say, oh, you have a president who says, I won't do wars, and whether they start wars or don't do wars, if there ends up being some conflict or some increase in global uncertainty, that has a negative repercussions on global economies. That started ripple effects that have had unintended consequences in everything from debt markets to across the world. So keep an eye on those things. And then you got Michael saying we got Canada trying to put together a 40 nation trading coalition, which is again a logical move for a lot of these countries who are facing US tariffs. And that would, to Michael's point, if they got together and they formed a policy that drastically, if it was the world against us, it would be very unfortunate to us. Oh, look at this, Scott. Thank you for answering it. The Iranian rial. There we go.
The
So
um,
yes.
the interesting point too that Michael makes here that I'm curious to also know what your downstream impact might be is Canada trying to put together a 40
Mm.
nation trading coalition with countries in Europe and China and so forth. If these things like I guess materialize, and what is the actual like long-term effect? Let's hypothetically say, right, I don't know, JD Vance wins in 2028 and you have a Republican presidency for the next, I don't know, 8 to 10 to 12 years, right? Like, how does that all pan out when perhaps, deglobalization here figures out? And this sounds like an Ian Bremmer question for some reason that I'm asking you. I'm curious to know. Yeah.
Okay. So let's break that down. So let's say we have the Canadian Curling Coalition. So let's say so first part of that question, Canada creates and they're successful. We get a whole bunch of nations together to form the anti-US trading
And the
bloc.
whole point is to isolate
Right.
the US, right? And
So
yeah.
that is the worst case scenario for the United States, for us as a country, is that the other countries which we've exploited and had these, not exploited, but we've had well, maybe exploited. Depends on the country. Well, maybe let's not get into that. But we've got this there is that I think if Canada is successful in creating something like that, that as a counterweight to the United States' trade demands, that forces us to the negotiation table. However, there's some interesting aspects about this government and future governments that are very different, right? So you think that historically, and this is what is ideologically interesting. So you think, okay, you're small government, maybe you support less or looking at, and you could point to the positive economic things. Okay, maybe that's improved regulation or improved regulation, less regulation, not necessarily improved regulation, or levels to improve company competitiveness globally. But things like tariffs take away from the company competitiveness of the United States, and so and there hasn't been a lot of motion towards doing things that might be constructive, like reducing, some barriers to things like construction or automated construction or zoning or other issues that might actually be perhaps favorable to people, to the GOP in like 30 years ago. And so we've got kind of this complex situation where you've got a request for small government, a nativist policy, and what that does is it has the effect of actually reducing the amount of trade that's happening between the United States and the globe. Less trade means less money. It means less richness. And I think a continued policy where we were both highly restrictive on immigration, highly inwardly oriented, does create economic stasis for us. So again, that I think is the worst possible situation, Albert. And I think the best possible situation is like a hypothetical government that, let's say, if you're stuck with, a Trump Vance situation, that they respond and whatever they promised a year ago, they pivot, right? Everybody can make a mistake, pivot, do something else on under international pressure. And that is the question of whether they would do that or not. Because I think that it could be a useful pivot that way, but I think the question is, will the stubbornness of or impertinence of a few people outweigh a general economic need? And I don't know. Aaron says we blew up the word financial architecture. We own the dollar. Exactly. We could literally we drastically unwind the United States' beneficial for us dominance of the global economy since 1944. And that's the fear, I think, if I were to encapsulate that. So hopefully that won't happen.
So
But
final
think,
thoughts for the job
yeah.
seekers on here. What do you say to your friends when they ask why you haven't found a job yet, and what's your advice for them?
Do not despair. Don't lose hope in even the darkest of times. I think that you've got, all right, so you're looking for a job for a while,
I
you've
feel
got
like in
specific
doing this
skills.
webinar, most of this time,
Yeah.
gosh, it's all been bad news.
It
And
has been. But again, at the same time, and I want to reiterate this, a lot of what we talk about is bad news because the bad news is interesting to talk about. It's also what people have questions about.
I mean,
But
it'd
there
be
are
nice to
things.
have an economic era where credit card debt is low and unemployment
Yes,
is actually low and people
I
have
know.
jobs and inflation is low and everybody can afford a home.
Is this webinar's existence correlated with people's economic malaise? Let's add
I
that as a
don't know.
variable.
But I mean, see,
Am
the
I
other the
am
other
I
stat we
bad
haven't
for people? Am I bad? Am I a bad person, Albert?
the other stat that we haven't even talked about yet from last year that came out that really shocked me was, did you see
Oh,
that the average age of a new hire is 42
oh,
years old?
yeah. God, isn't that crazy?
It's not new grads. It's somebody in their
No.
40s. I'm 38 and I'm below
Ah,
average of the new hire. Like
I
what
know.
is this?
Yeah, look at this young buck coming in and taking this. Albert, the new intern that's crazy. Which is interesting. So there's two responses. You can look at this and be like, well, it's response to American demographics, right? Because we know, in
Sure.
generally speaking, the median age has gotten a little older.
But
But
the
at that
average
same
new home
time,
buyer is also like 60.
right. But to that point, you've seen, and I know on the college side of things, our big concern is those new hires, those companies hiring new folks. That has dropped off considerably in the last couple of years. And colleges are feeling that because the graduates coming out of there they just don't have the offers they did a few years ago. And so without that low end of the market, those 22-year-olds, suddenly then you've got immediately the people they're hiring are these experienced folks. I'm not surprised by those numbers. But I would say to this point though, and those things too, especially so whether you're a young worker who is already a little bit disappointed over the status of the job market, reskill, build, learn things, seek out jobs in places you wouldn't look for otherwise. And this is the thing. This is the thing about life, right? You look at these things and everything we worry about, the small things, the day to day, the work trauma, all that stuff, none of this really matters. You look at the things, find what brings you satisfaction. What brings you joy in this respect, not merely a paycheck?
Go
What are
tend
the
some
things you
sheep,
joy? What brings you true satisfaction in life? And it is so worthwhile when you find it. Go on Albert's list, host a webinar with a bunch of really smart, talented job seekers, and you'll be very satisfied with the progress you made.
That's
Oh, I still haven't used my 2024 CS degree. Great. Melanie, that sounds like that's your homework. Use it. Let's do it. Let's get some Albert's List contract work for you.
and I mean, yeah, the other side is that there are now also fewer computer science majors too, as evidenced in this TechCrunch article, right?
I
So it's
know
like,
it's an issue.
I mean, right? I mean, that's just behavior correlating in the way that we expect it to. But good, okay. I'm
Right.
glad, and I know we are a little bit past, so I want to thank you again for coming. Um, Dr. White will be back here on May the 12th, March the 12th, rather. And so he'll be here to talk again about economic trends. I'll be here to be your co-host, and we're going to talk more about where this year's economy is headed, and a lot could happen in 3 weeks. So yeah, once again, thank you all for attending. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. White, for being here. And we will all see you soon at a future date. And between now and when we meet again, best of luck in your job search. And we'll see you at many of our other webinars. Take care and goodbye.
Thanks, guys, for coming.